The river below Thornecombe ran gold and then grey as the sun slipped behind the hills, and Marianne Hale knelt at its edge with her sleeves pinned above her elbows, working a linen shirt against the flat stone the washerwomen called the Widow's Rock, though no one now living remembered which widow had given it the name. The water was cold enough to bite. She did not mind it. Cold water asked nothing of her heart, and that was more than she could say for most things in her life that autumn. She did not see the man on the bridge at first. He had come quietly, the way a person comes who does not wish to be noticed, and he stood at the crown of the old stone arch, with his coat collar turned up against the wind, watching the small figure below him scrub linen with a fierce, unhurried competence that struck him as strange to watch, though he could not yet have said why. He told himself he had stopped only to rest his horse. That was not entirely a lie, but he stayed longer than resting required, and he watched longer than courtesy allowed, because there was something in the way she worked, humming under her breath, pausing now and then to press a wet knuckle to her own aching back, laughing once, briefly, at nothing he could see, that seemed to him entirely unrehearsed. He had spent a great deal of his life surrounded by people who rehearsed everything. A woman who laughed when she believed herself alone was, to him, a species he had nearly forgotten existed. He did not know her name yet. He would learn it before the sun was fully down, and he would spend the following months wondering whether he had done wrong to learn it at all, given who he was and what he had come to Thornecombe to do. His name, the one that mattered to dukes and creditors and the king's own household, was Gareth Ashworth Vane, 7th Duke of Larkmoor. But the man on the bridge that evening called himself Gareth Fenwick, a steward come to survey a distant parcel of the estate's tenant lands, and he had told this lie so many times in the past fortnight that it had begun to feel less like a disguise and more like a second skin he had not expected to enjoy wearing. He had come to Thornecombe because his aunt, Lady Ophelia Vane, had grown tired of watching him refuse every eligible woman paraded before him in London, and had declared, with the particular cruelty of people who love us and are out of patience, that he no longer knew how to recognize a genuine woman when he saw one, that he had been so thoroughly ruined by Cressida Ashford's betrayal 3 years before that he mistook every silence for scheming and every kindness for calculation. She had dared him, in the end, to go somewhere no one knew his face and find out for himself whether he still knew the difference between a woman who wanted him and a woman who wanted his title. He had taken the dare more out of pride than curiosity. He had not expected, on only his 4th evening in the village, to find himself standing on a bridge at dusk, unable to look away from a woman he had never met, who did not know he existed, and who was, at that very moment, wringing out a shirt with more devotion than most great ladies gave to prayer. Marianne felt the weight of being watched before she understood its source, a prickling at the back of her neck, the particular awareness that comes to women who have learned, through hard use, to notice when they are no longer alone. She looked up and saw him, a tall figure against the darkening sky, his face unreadable at that distance, his stillness somehow more unsettling than if he had called out to her. "You'll catch your death standing up there in this wind," she said, because she had never in her life managed to hold her tongue when silence would have served her better, and because there was something in the set of his shoulders that struck her, absurdly, as lonely. "I might say the same of you, kneeling in a river at dusk," he answered, and his voice, when it came, was low and even, with none of the rough country vowels she expected from a man dressed as plainly as he was. She noted that, filed it away without quite knowing why it mattered, and returned to her work because the sun was going and there was no time to waste in idle talk with strangers on bridges, however curious their voices. "Some of us have not the luxury of choosing our hours," she said. "The linen does not wash itself, sir, and Mrs. Pruitt does not pay me to admire the view." "Pruitt," he repeated, and something in his tone sharpened, though she could not have said what. "You wash for the Pruitt household?" "I wash for whoever will have me washing," she said, a little more sharply than she intended, for the name Pruitt sat like a stone in her chest these days, and she did not care to discuss it with a stranger. Is that a crime in these parts, or only a curiosity to men who stand on bridges at dusk? He laughed then, a short, surprised sound, as though laughter itself had come upon him unexpectedly, and something in Marianne's chest loosened slightly at the sound of it, though she would have denied, if asked, that it meant anything at all. "Forgive me," he said. "I am new to Thornecombe. I did not mean to pry." "Then you have chosen a poor way of not prying," she said. But there was no venom in it now, only a dry humour that made him smile in the near dark, unseen. "What brings a stranger to a bridge over a river no one paints and no one sings about?" "I am come to look over some land for my employer," he said, and the lie sat easily on his tongue, easier than he expected a lie to sit. "I am told the tenant farms along this stretch want attention." "They want more than attention," Marianne said, wringing the shirt with sudden vigour, as though the very thought of the tenant farms had put strength back into her arms. "They want a landlord who has seen his own fields with his own eyes, instead of a steward's reports written by men who have never walked them. But I suppose that is not your fault, if you are only sent to look." He was quiet for a moment, and in that moment she wondered if she had offended him, if he was, after all, some petty overseer proud of his small authority, the sort who would report her insolence to whoever paid her wages and see her turned out for it. She had learned to fear that particular silence in men. It usually came before something worse. But when he spoke again, his voice held no anger. "You speak plainly, for a woman who does not know who I might tell." "I speak plainly because I have very little left to lose by it," Marianne said, and did not explain further, and gathered her wet linen into her basket, and rose from the widow's rock with the particular grace of a woman who has learned to make even weariness look like dignity. "Good evening to you, sir. Mind the wind on your way down. The bridge steps are treacherous after rain." She was gone into the blue dark before he could think of a way to keep her there, and he stood alone on the bridge for a long while afterward, turning over in his mind a single sentence she had spoken. "I have very little left to lose," and finding that it troubled him more than anything a woman had said to him in 3 long years. He did not sleep well that night, in the small room he had taken above the Thornecombe Inn under the name Fenwick. He told himself it was only curiosity, the ordinary interest a man takes in an unusual person met by chance. He was, after all, a duke who had spent the better part of his adult life being lied to by women who knew precisely who he was and precisely what they wanted from him, and it was only natural, was it not, that a woman who plainly did not know his rank and who spoke to him as though he were an ordinary man of no particular consequence should strike him as a novelty worth a second look. He told himself this for 3 days, and on the 4th day he found himself walking down toward the river again at dusk, telling himself it was only to inspect the state of the bridge. She was there again, as he had somehow known she would be, her basket at her side, her sleeves rolled, her hair coming loose from its pins in the way it always seemed to by that hour, as though the day itself had worked its way through her and left its evidence in small disorder. She glanced up at his approach and did not look surprised to see him, though she did not smile either, only regarded him with the wary, measuring look of a woman deciding how much of herself was safe to give away. "Come to inspect the bridge again, Mr. Fenwick?" she asked, and he found he liked the sound of the false name in her mouth more than he liked the sound of his true one in the mouths of half the drawing-rooms in London. "Come to inspect the river," he said. "I am told it floods the low fields most winters. I wish to see the banks for myself." "How thorough of you," she said, with the faintest edge of teasing that told him she did not entirely believe him, though she could not have guessed the shape of the truth he was hiding. "Most stewards I have known would send a boy to look and write the report from the comfort of a chair. Perhaps I am not most stewards. Perhaps you are not," she agreed, and there was something searching in the way she said it, as though she were turning the sentence over to see what lay beneath it, and finding, for now, only more questions. They talked longer that evening than either of them intended. He learned her name, Marianne Hale, and that her father had been a soldier who had died at sea when she was 12, leaving her mother to marry, out of necessity rather than affection, a widower named Josiah Crane, who kept a small tannery on the edge of the village and resented, in the particular quiet way of unhappy men, every mouth he had not chosen to feed. He learned that her mother had died 4 years past, of a fever that the physician called consumption and the village called grief, though Marianne did not say which she believed. He learned that she washed linen for 3 households in the village, including, to her evident distaste, that of Mr. Josiah Pruitt, a wool merchant of considerable means, and by her account, considerably less charm, who had lately taken to calling at her stepfather's house with a frequency that could mean only one thing. She did not say the word marriage aloud that first evening, but he heard it anyway, in the tightness of her voice when she spoke of Pruitt, and something in him, something he did not examine too closely, recoiled at the thought of a man like that laying claim to a woman like this. He, for his part, told her almost nothing true, and felt the weight of that omission more heavily with each visit. He told her he had grown up on a large estate, but was not its heir. True enough, in its way, since he had inherited nothing from anyone, but had been born already possessing it, which felt, to his private amusement, rather like a different sort of lie altogether. He told her his mother had died when he was young, and his father when he was 21, which was entirely true, and he watched her face soften with a sympathy that made his chest ache, with something he did not have a name for yet. By the 5th evening, he had stopped pretending to himself that he came to the river to inspect anything at all. By the 7th, she had stopped pretending she did not watch the road each afternoon for the shape of him coming down toward the water. It was on the 9th evening that she asked him, with the directness that had first startled and then delighted him, why a mere steward troubled himself to walk 2 miles from the manor each day merely to talk with a washerwoman at a river. "Perhaps I find the conversation superior to any I am offered elsewhere," he said, which was true, and which cost him nothing to say, and which made her laugh, a real laugh, unguarded, the same one he had heard from the bridge on the very first evening, and which he had come, in the space of 9 days, to think of as the finest sound he knew. "You flatter me, sir, and I have not the vanity to enjoy it as I ought," she said, though the colour in her cheeks suggested otherwise. "A steward's conversation and a washerwoman's, we are neither of us drawing-room company. I wonder what it is you find so superior." "Honesty," he said, before he could stop himself, and meant it more than she could know. "You have not once, in 9 evenings, asked me for anything, or flattered me, or tried to discover whether I might be of use to you. Do you know how rare that is, Miss Hale?" She considered him for a long moment, her expression unreadable in the failing light, and then said quietly, "I have found that wanting things from men rarely gets a woman anything but disappointment. It is easier and safer to want nothing at all." The words settled into him like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples he would feel for a long time afterward. He thought of Cressida, who had wanted everything, his title, his houses, his name on a marriage settlement, and had wanted none of it enough to stay once a wealthier prospect appeared. He thought of the 2 years since, in which he had measured every woman who smiled at him against the certainty that she smiled at the Duke and not the man, and had found himself, slowly and without quite meaning to, retreating from the whole business of being known. And here was a woman who wanted nothing from him because she had learned, through harder use than he cared to imagine, that wanting was a luxury she could not afford, and it was precisely this that made him want, with an intensity that frightened him, to give her everything. He should have told her the truth that night. He knew it, even as he walked back up the hill toward the inn, the lantern light of the village glowing faintly through the trees. He should have said, "I am not a steward. I am the Duke of Larkmoor, and I have been lying to you for 9 days because I did not trust myself to know the difference between a woman who loved me and a woman who loved my title, and I am ashamed to say that some part of me still does not trust it, even now." He did not say it. He told himself there would be time. He told himself the truth would keep a little longer, that he needed only a few more evenings to be certain of what he felt before he risked the earthquake that revealing himself would surely cause. He told himself many things that autumn, and very few of them, he would later admit, had been entirely honest. There were other evenings between the 9th and the trouble, evenings that Marianne would later hold in memory the way a person holds the last warm days before a hard winter, not knowing yet how precious they were until the cold arrived to teach her. There was the evening it rained without warning, a sudden autumn squall that caught them both on the open bank, and he had stripped off his own coat without a word and settled it over her shoulders before she could protest, standing beside her in his shirt sleeves in the driving wet, as though it cost him nothing, as though warming her mattered more to him than his own comfort ever could. She had scolded him for it, called him foolish, told him a steward's wages would not stretch to a chill on the lungs, and he had only laughed and said that some things were worth the risk of a chill, and she had gone home that night with his coat still faintly warm from his body, and had not been able to sleep for thinking of it. There was the afternoon, some days later, when a fine carriage passed through Thornecombe on its way to Larkmoor Hall, and Marianne, delivering linen to the baker's wife, saw within it a beautiful woman in travelling silks who glanced out at the muddy village street with an expression of frank distaste, and asked, of no one in particular, whether the coachman was quite certain this squalid little place was truly on the road to the Duke's estate. Marianne learned later from the baker's wife that the lady was a Miss Cressida Ashford, once very nearly betrothed to the Duke himself, and now come, it was whispered, to renew the acquaintance now that her own more recent engagement had collapsed under the weight of her fiancé's sudden bankruptcy. She said nothing of this to Gareth when next they met, telling herself it was none of her concern what ladies of fashion came and went from Larkmoor Hall, but she found, all the same, that she watched him more closely that evening, searching his face for some shadow of the old attachment, and was ashamed of herself for searching, and more ashamed still of the small, unworthy relief she felt when she found no shadow there at all, only the same steady attention he always gave her, as though Cressida Ashford's silk-lined carriage had never passed within a mile of him. He, in fact, knew nothing yet of Cressida's arrival, and would not learn of it for some days, being occupied at the time with matters of tenant drainage that were not entirely invented, since he had, almost by accident, become genuinely useful to the very farms he had first used as his excuse for lingering in the village. It amused him, privately, to discover that his invented purpose had become a real one, that he had walked more of his own land in a fortnight of disguise than in 3 years of managing it from London, and that he owed this discovery too to the woman at the river who had shamed him gently, on their very first evening, into wondering whether he had ever truly looked at anything he owned. It was on one of these evenings, with the drainage papers still creased in his coat pocket, that he came nearest to telling her everything, before Pruitt's proposal ever forced the matter into the open. They had fallen into a comfortable quiet, sitting on the bank some distance from the Widow's Rock, watching the last ducks settle for the night among the reeds, and Marianne had said, apropos of nothing, that she sometimes wondered what it would be like to see London, though she supposed a washerwoman had no business wondering such things. "I could show it to you," he said, before he could stop himself, and heard, in his own voice, an eagerness that startled him. "The city, I mean. There is a great deal of it worth seeing, whatever the ton makes of the rest." "You speak as though you have some particular claim upon it," she said, teasing, not truly suspicious, and he felt the confession rise in his throat, felt the shape of the words. "I have a house on Grosvenor Square and a seat in the House of Lords, and I could take you there myself, tomorrow, if you would let me," and felt, in the same instant, the old fear close over them, like a hand smothering a candle. "I have travelled there a good deal, on my employer's business," he said instead, and hated himself, faintly, for the smallness of the lie even as he told it, because it was the first time the disguise had felt not like protection, but like theft of a moment that might have changed everything had he only trusted it. She did not press him further, sensing perhaps some private reluctance she did not wish to trespass upon, and the moment passed, and the ducks settled, and the evening ended, as all their evenings ended, with a reluctant goodbye at the base of the bridge, and a promise, unspoken but understood, that there would be another evening after this one. He rode back to Larkmoor Hall that night, more troubled than he had been in weeks, turning the missed confession over and over, and it was this very unease, this gnawing awareness that he was running out of road on which to keep his secret safely hidden, that made Lady Ophelia's arrival and her fatally indiscreet dinner-table remark land with such catastrophic timing only a few days later. He had been, in his own private reckoning, no more than a week from telling Marianne the truth himself, in his own time, in his own careful words. He was not given that week. The county gossip took the matter out of his hands entirely and delivered it to Marianne in the ugliest possible shape, through the mouth of a furious and humiliated wool merchant standing in her stepfather's parlour. The trouble came, as trouble in Thornecombe always seemed to, from the direction of Josiah Pruitt. Marianne's stepfather summoned her to the parlour on a wet Tuesday evening, a fortnight after her first conversation with the man she knew as Gareth Fenwick, and informed her, without preamble or apparent regret, that Mr. Pruitt had made her an offer of marriage, and that he, Josiah Crane, had accepted it on her behalf, as was entirely his right as her guardian, and that the wedding would take place before Christmas, on account of certain debts Mr. Pruitt had generously agreed to absorb in exchange for the arrangement. "You will thank me for this in time," her stepfather said, not meeting her eyes, which told her more than his words did. "Pruitt is a man of means. You will want for nothing." "I will want for happiness," Marianne said, though she knew even as she said it that happiness was not a currency her stepfather traded in, and had never been, not since her mother's death, had removed the last soft thing from his household. "Happiness," he said, with the particular contempt of a man who had buried whatever capacity for it he once possessed, "is a luxury for women whose fathers left them fortunes. Yours left you nothing but debts and a daughter to feed. You will marry Pruitt, and you will be grateful, and that is the end of the matter." She did not weep in front of him. She had learned, over 4 hard years in his house, that tears bought her nothing but his impatience. She went instead to her small room beneath the eaves, and sat on the edge of her narrow bed, and stared at the rain streaking the single window, and thought of the man on the bridge, and felt something inside her chest crack quietly down the middle, because whatever she had allowed herself to imagine over 9 evenings by the river had just been rendered impossible by a debt she had not incurred and a bargain she had never been asked to approve. She did not go to the river the next evening, nor the one after. On the 3rd evening, unable to bear the silence of her own dread any longer, she went, and found him already waiting on the bank, his expression tightening with visible relief and then concern the moment he saw her face. "What has happened?" he asked, and the steward's careful distance he had maintained for 9 evenings dissolved entirely, so that he closed the space between them without seeming to notice he had done it, and took her cold hands in his before either of them thought to question the propriety of it. She told him of Pruitt's offer and her stepfather's debts and the wedding set for before Christmas, and she watched something move behind his eyes that she could not name, a fury, held carefully in check, that seemed disproportionate to the position of a mere steward hearing a washerwoman's misfortune. "He cannot force you," he said, though even as he said it, he knew the law offered her very little protection against a guardian's decision, and hated the knowing. "He is my guardian in the eyes of the law, whatever he was to my mother in life," Marianne said, and her voice, though steady, carried a grief so old and so worn smooth that it frightened him more than any weeping could have. "There is no one to say otherwise. There is no one who would trouble themselves to try." "I would," he said, before he had decided to say it, and the words hung in the cold air between them, with a weight neither of them was yet prepared to examine. She looked at him then, truly looked, as though seeing him for the first time, and something in her expression shifted from grief toward a wary, dangerous hope, the kind she had trained herself for years not to feel, because hope, in her experience, was only disappointment that had not yet arrived. "You are a steward, Mr. Fenwick," she said quietly. "You have no more power to stop this than I do." He opened his mouth to tell her the truth. He felt the words rise in his throat. "I am not a steward. I am the 7th Duke of Larkmoor, and I have influence enough in this county to unmake Josiah Pruitt's fortune before the week is out, if I chose to." And he felt, too, the old fear rise beside them, the fear that the moment she knew who he truly was, everything soft and unguarded in her face would harden into calculation, that she would look at him and see not Gareth, but a title, a fortune, an escape from Pruitt, bought with a different kind of bargain. He said nothing. He only tightened his hands around hers and said, "Give me time. I may be able to help more than you think." It was not quite a lie. It was not either the truth, and the space between those two things would come to cost him more than he yet understood. The following days passed in a strange, suspended agony. Marianne went about her washing with a hollow diligence, scrubbing linen until her knuckles bled, because the work at least demanded nothing of her heart, while her mind turned endlessly over the wedding, drawing closer, and the strange, urgent tenderness of the man who called himself Fenwick, and who had promised, with no visible means to make good on it, that he could help. Gareth, for his part, rode hard for Larkmoor Hall the very next morning, 3 miles distant, and spent 2 days in furious correspondence and quiet inquiry, using the considerable machinery of his true position to discover precisely what debts Josiah Crane owed to Josiah Pruitt, and precisely how those debts had been structured, and precisely what leverage a duke might bring to bear upon a country wool merchant who had thought himself dealing only with a desperate widower and had not reckoned on the interest of anyone grander. It was during this same fortnight that his aunt, Lady Ophelia, arrived at Larkmoor Hall unannounced, having grown impatient waiting in London for word of her nephew's supposed education in the differences between real and false affection, and it was Lady Ophelia, sharp-eyed, formidable, and utterly unable to keep a secret she found delicious, who let slip, at a dinner attended by half the gentry of the county, including Josiah Pruitt himself, that her nephew, the Duke of Larkmoor, had lately taken an interest in a certain washerwoman of Thornecombe village. The words travelled, as words in a small county always do, with a speed that outpaced every attempt to contain them. By the following evening, the story had reached Pruitt's ears in a form considerably more scandalous than the truth, that the Duke had been secretly courting the girl for weeks under a false name, that he meant to make her his mistress, or perhaps, in the wilder tellings, his duchess, and that the wedding to Pruitt was very likely to be humiliatingly disrupted by a man whose displeasure no wool merchant in the county could afford to earn. Pruitt, being a proud man and not an especially brave one, did not confront the Duke. He confronted Marianne instead, arriving at her stepfather's house in a fury that frightened even Josiah Crane, and accusing her, before her own hearth, of having played him for a fool while secretly entertaining the attentions of a duke in disguise, of having known all along who Fenwick truly was, and of having used the connection to escape a bargain she had found beneath her. "I knew nothing," Marianne said, white-faced, genuinely bewildered, for the word Duke had struck her like a physical blow, and she stood in her stepfather's parlour, turning it over and over, trying to make it fit against the man she had known by the river, his plain coat, his careful hands, his voice that had never once, in all their evenings together, carried the note of command she now understood a duke's voice must surely carry. I did not know. I swear to you, I did not know. But Pruitt did not believe her, and worse, she saw in her stepfather's face a calculation that frightened her more than Pruitt's fury, the swift, ugly arithmetic of a man wondering whether a connection to a duke, however scandalous, might yet be turned to profit. It was in this state, furious, humiliated, and reeling, that Marianne went to the river the following dusk, not to meet him, for she told herself she would never willingly seek him out again, but because the river was the only place in Thornecombe that had ever felt like hers, and she needed, more than she had ever needed anything, a single hour that belonged to no one's schemes but her own grief. He was there. Of course he was there. He was always there, and she understood now, with a bitterness that surprised her by how deeply it cut, that he had always had the power to simply, somewhere, to arrive and depart as he pleased, because the whole county bent itself around his convenience, whether he wore a steward's plain coat or not. "You lied to me," she said, before he could speak, and her voice shook with an anger that was, beneath it, mostly grief. "For weeks, every evening, you sat here and let me tell you about my stepfather, and my mother, and Pruitt, and you never once thought to mention that you were a duke, that you could have ended this with a single letter, that you were laughing at me the whole." "I was never laughing at you," he said, and the raw urgency in his voice stopped her mid-sentence. "Marianne, I swear to you, I have never in my life been more in earnest than I have been with you." "Then why?" she demanded, and the word broke slightly in the middle. "Why the lie? What was I to you? Some experiment? Some diversion from your London ladies, to see how a washerwoman behaves when she does not know she is being watched by a duke?" The accusation landed closer to a painful truth than he cared to admit, and he saw it register on her face that he had hesitated a beat too long before answering. "It began," he said slowly, forcing himself to honesty, though every instinct in him wanted to soften it, as something like that. "I will not lie to you again, not even to spare myself your anger. I came to this county because a woman I once meant to marry proved, in the end, to love my title far better than she loved me, and I had grown so frightened of being deceived again that I no longer trusted myself to tell the difference. My aunt dared me to find out whether I still could. I did not expect, when I stood on that bridge and watched you at the river, that I would find the answer so quickly, or that it would matter to me so much." "And when did it stop being an experiment?" Marianne asked, her voice quieter now, though no less wounded. "The first evening you spoke to me as though I were simply a man standing on a bridge," he said. "I do not think it was ever an experiment again after that. But by the time I knew that, by the time I understood what you had come to mean to me, I found I could not tell you the truth, because I was afraid. I was afraid that the moment you knew who I truly was, you would look at me differently. I was afraid I would lose the one thing I had found in 3 years that felt real. I told myself I would tell you when I was certain. I was a coward, Marianne, and I am sorrier for it than I have words to say." She was silent for a long moment, the wind moving in the bare branches above them, the river running dark and cold below. "You let me humiliate myself," she said finally. "Pruitt came to my house tonight and called me a liar and a schemer before my own stepfather, and I stood there with no notion what he meant, because you had never told me the truth that might have prepared me for it. Do you understand what it is, to be accused of a deception you did not know you were part of?" "I understand that it is unforgivable," he said quietly, "and I do not ask you to forgive it tonight. I ask only that you believe this much. Nothing I felt for you was false, not one evening, not one word." "Feelings are easy to claim," Marianne said, drawing her shawl tighter, her eyes bright with unshed tears she refused to let fall in front of him. "It is what a man does that shows what he truly values, Your Grace," and the title came out of her mouth with a deliberate, cutting formality that landed exactly as she intended it to. And thus far, All you have done is lie to me for a month and let me be humiliated for it. I do not know what you expect me to feel toward that, beyond precisely what I feel now, which is that I would rather have never known you at all." She turned and left him standing on the riverbank in the near dark, and he did not follow her, because he understood, with the particular clarity that comes only after we have already done the damage, that following her that night would only prove, once again, that he thought his wishes outweighed her wounds. He spent that night, and the several that followed, in a grim and determined labor that he did not announce to her, because he had learned at least that much, that declarations meant nothing now, and only action would. He discovered, through his agents, that Josiah Crane's debts to Pruitt were not so simple as they had first appeared, that Pruitt had, in fact, engineered a portion of those debts deliberately, extending credit at terms designed to trap a desperate widower, precisely so that he might one day call the debt due and claim, in payment, the one asset Crane possessed that Pruitt actually wanted, his stepdaughter's hand, and through her, whatever small property had come to Marianne from her late father, a modest inheritance her stepfather had never troubled to mention to her, and which Pruitt's lawyers had discovered before she herself ever knew it existed. Gareth bought the debts outright, every note and every bond, paying Pruitt's own creditors before Pruitt himself understood what was happening, and then, in a final stroke that gave him more satisfaction than he cared to admit, he forgave the debts entirely, not to Crane, whose treatment of Marianne he had no wish to reward, but directly to Marianne herself, placing the small inheritance her father had left her, along with the cancelled bonds, into a trust that no stepfather and no unwanted suitor could touch, administered by a solicitor of her own choosing. He did this quietly, without spectacle, and without once appearing at Thornecombe himself, because he understood, at last, that the gift meant nothing if it arrived wrapped in his own desire to be thanked for it. Pruitt, ruined in his designs and humiliated before the county, withdrew his suit within the fortnight, blustering about breach of promise, until his own solicitor quietly informed him that pursuing the matter would only invite closer inquiry into the manner in which his original debts had been structured, inquiry he could not afford. Josiah Crane, robbed of both leverage and profit, retreated into a sullen silence that Marianne found, for the first time in 4 years, she no longer feared, because she understood now that his power over her had always been smaller than he had allowed her to believe, and that it had, in the end, evaporated the moment someone with true power chose to stand quietly against it. She learned of all this not from Gareth, who sent no letter and made no visit, but from the solicitor who arrived at her stepfather's door to explain the trust, and from the gossip of the village, which moved, as it always did, faster than any official word. She sat with the solicitor's papers spread before her on the kitchen table, her hands trembling, and understood, with a fullness that took her breath away, precisely what had been done for her, and precisely how carefully it had been done to ask nothing of her in return. She did not know, for several days, what to do with the understanding. Pride told her to remain angry, that a man who could undo such damage with a single stroke of his pen might easily have prevented it in the first place, had he only told her the truth from the start, and that his silence now, however generous its cause, felt like one more decision made about her life, without her consent. But something quieter and more honest, underneath the pride, kept returning to the memory of his face on the riverbank, the raw and unguarded fear in it, when he had said, "I was afraid I would lose the one thing I had found in 3 years that felt real." And she found she could not, however she tried, believe that fear had been a performance. The village, in the days that followed, did not spare her. She went to market on the Saturday after Pruitt's accusation, because the household still needed bread, and there was no one else to fetch it, and she felt every eye in the square turn toward her, felt the whispers move through the stalls faster than she could walk past them. "There she is, the one who caught a duke's eye, though how a washerwoman managed it is anyone's guess. And worse, from the more spiteful corners, no better than she should be, mark my words, playing at innocence with a man's true name hidden from her the whole while, as though any decent woman would not have suspected something. She did not run from it, though every part of her wanted to. She walked the length of the square with her basket on her arm and her chin level, and when old Mrs. Abbott, who had known her mother, stopped her outright in front of the draper's shop and asked, with poorly disguised relish, whether it was true she had known all along and only pretended otherwise for effect, Marianne set her basket down, looked the woman steadily in the eye, and said, in a voice pitched to carry to every listening ear in the square, that she had known a kind stranger who listened to her troubles without once asking anything of her in return, and that if the whole county wished to punish her for having been, for a few weeks, genuinely and unknowingly happy, then the whole county was welcome to its opinion, but she would not apologize for a happiness she had done nothing wrong to earn. The square went quiet for a moment at that, and then Mrs. Abbott, who was not unkind so much as idle for want of better entertainment, had the grace to look faintly ashamed, and muttered something about no harm meant, and the worst of the whispering, though it did not vanish entirely, lost some of its teeth after that. Marianne walked home with her bread and her dignity both intact, and told herself, fiercely, that whatever came of the wreckage Pruitt and gossip had made of her small happiness, she would not be made to feel shame for a thing that had, in its heart, never been shameful at all. It was Lady Ophelia, of all people, who finally forced the matter to its resolution, arriving at Thornecombe unannounced one bright, cold morning in a carriage that drew half the village to their windows, and requesting, with the particular imperiousness of a woman long accustomed to being obeyed, a private word with Miss Hale. "My nephew is making himself perfectly wretched," Lady Ophelia announced, without preamble, once they were seated in the small, cold front room of Crane's house, which she surveyed with an expression that suggested she found it wanting in every particular. "He has not eaten a proper meal in a fortnight. He has quarrelled with his steward, dismissed 2 secretaries for imagined slights, and spends his evenings staring at correspondence he does not answer. I dared him, some weeks ago, to discover whether he still knew a genuine woman when he found one. I did not intend for the dare to end with him, too much a coward to finish what he started." "He is not a coward," Marianne said, before she had decided to defend him, and then flushed at the swiftness of her own reply. "No," Lady Ophelia agreed, with a small, satisfied smile that suggested this was precisely the answer she had come to hear. "I did not think he was, either. But he believes you think so, and he has decided, in his infinite and infuriating pride, that the kindest thing he can do for you now is to leave you entirely alone, so that whatever you choose regarding him, you choose it free of any further pressure from his rank or his wealth. He is, in short, being a perfect fool about the whole business, and I have come to ask whether you might be persuaded to help him stop." Marianne was quiet for a long moment, looking down at her own reddened hands, still marked from years at the washing stone, and thought of everything those hands had scrubbed and wrung and endured, and of a man who had watched her do it, and found, in that unglamorous labor, something he called real. "I do not know if I can trust him," she said finally, honestly. "Not the way I would need to build a life beside a man who could undo my whole world with a single lie, and then undo the lie's damage with a single fortune. Those are not small things to reconcile, my lady." "No," Lady Ophelia said, "they are not. But I will tell you what I have observed in nearly 30 years of watching my nephew, Miss Hale, since his mother died and left him far too young to bear what he was made to bear. He does not give his heart easily, and he has been burned badly enough, once, that I did not think he would risk it again in my lifetime. Whatever else you believe of him, believe this. A man who has spent a fortnight refusing his dinner over a washerwoman he met on a bridge is not a man playing games. He is a man who is frightened, for the first time in years, of losing something that matters. She left Marianne with those words and a card bearing the direction of Larkmoor Hall, and drove away in her fine carriage, and left the whole village buzzing for a week over what business a duke's aunt could possibly have had with Josiah Crane's stepdaughter. Marianne did not go to Larkmoor Hall, not that week, nor the next. She told herself she needed time, and this was true, but she also found, in the quiet hours at the washing stone, that her anger had begun to wear thin against the weight of everything she now understood, that the lie had been born of fear rather than cruelty, that the fortune had been given without any expectation of gratitude, that the man who had watched her from the bridge had, in every way that mattered beyond the single, enormous omission of his name, been exactly the man he had shown her he was. It was the river, in the end, that decided her, the same river, the same dusk light turning gold and then grey, the same widow's rock where she had knelt on the evening it all began. She went down to it one cold evening in late November, not to wash linen, for she had none of Pruitt's or anyone else's family to wash for any longer, but simply because the river had become, over the strange and painful autumn, the one place where she had learned to be honest with herself, and she needed, standing at its edge, to finally ask herself the only question that mattered, not whether she could forgive him, but whether she wanted to. She was still standing there, watching the last light fade from the water, when she heard footsteps on the bridge above her, familiar, hesitant footsteps, and she turned and saw him there, not in a steward's plain coat this time, but in clothes that made no pretense at all of what he was, and she understood that he had come, at last, without disguise, to stand before her exactly as he was, and let her choose, with full knowledge, whatever she chose. "I told myself I would not come," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the small distance in the still evening air. "I told myself you deserved to be left in peace, to decide without my presence weighing on you. I have failed at that resolution for a fortnight, Marianne, and tonight I find I cannot keep failing at it quietly. I had rather fail loudly, in front of you, than go on failing alone." "You are trespassing on a very ordinary bridge, Your Grace," she said, though there was no coldness in it now, only a fragile, careful warmth she had not allowed herself in weeks. "I understand. You own a great many finer ones." "I own no bridge that matters to me as much as this one," he said, and came down the bank toward her, slowly, as though she were something that might startle and vanish if he moved too quickly. "I do not know how to ask your forgiveness in a way that does not sound like one more thing I am demanding of you. So I will not ask for it tonight. I will only say what is true, and let you do with it what you will. I love you, Marianne Hale. I loved you before I knew what to do with loving you, and I loved you badly, for a time, because I was too great a coward to trust you with the truth of who I was. But I have never, in any evening we spent together, loved anything false. Not your laugh, not your temper, not your stubbornness about that wretched washing stone. All of it was real to me. All of it is real to me still." She looked at him for a long moment, the last light gone now, only the moon rising pale over the water, and felt something in her chest that she had spent 4 hard years teaching herself not to feel, because hope, she had always believed, was a luxury reserved for women whose lives had not taught them better. "I do not know how to be a duchess," she said finally, and it was, in its way, the most honest thing she could have said, because it was not a refusal, but a fear laid bare, the last wall she had left to offer him. "I do not require a duchess," he said. "I require a woman who tells me the truth, even when it costs her something to say it, and who laughs when she thinks no one is watching, and who has never once, in all our evenings together, asked me for anything at all. I have had my fill, Marianne, of women who wanted my title. I find I want, more than I have wanted anything in my life, a woman who very nearly did not want me at all, because she had already been taught that wanting brought only disappointment. Let me be the exception to that lesson. I am asking you to let me spend the rest of my life proving I can be." She crossed the last small distance between them then, because she found, standing at the edge of the same cold water where it had all begun, that she had already answered her own question days before, sitting alone with it at the washing stone, and had only been waiting, without quite admitting it to herself, for him to come and ask. "You lied to me for a month," she said, very quietly, her hand coming to rest, of its own accord, against his chest. "I did," he said, not flinching from it. "You had better spend a very long time making up for it," she said, and felt, rather than saw, the sudden loosening of tension through his whole body, the held breath finally released. "I intend to spend the rest of my life at it," he said, "and I find, strangely, that I am looking forward to every year of the labour." The wedding, when it came the following spring, was not held in London, where half the county's gentry would have gathered to gawk at the Duke of Larkmoor's astonishing choice of bride, but in the small stone chapel at Thornecombe, before the villagers who had known Marianne Hale as a washerwoman and now watched her, with a fierce and complicated pride they had not expected to feel, become something else entirely, without ever once ceasing to be herself. Lady Ophelia wept unashamedly in the front pew and declared to anyone who would listen that she had known it from the very first, though she had, in fact, known nothing of the sort, and had only hoped, which she considered, on reflection, close enough to the same thing. Josiah Crane did not attend. He had removed himself, some months before, to a distant town where his failures were not so widely known, and Marianne found, to her own quiet surprise, that she did not miss him, and had, in fact, stopped thinking of him almost entirely from the moment the trust papers were signed, as though the whole long weight of him had simply lifted from her shoulders and dispersed into the ordinary air. Pruitt, for his part, sold his business within the year and left the county altogether, having found that a man who had once been publicly humiliated by a duke rarely prospered afterward among neighbours who remembered every detail of the story and delighted, as country neighbours always do, in retelling it. Marianne kept, all her life, a small, unremarkable stone from the bank of the Thornecombe River, worn smooth by years of linen and lye, and she would tell her children, when they were old enough to sit still for the story, that their father had first loved their mother not for anything she owned or anything she wore, but for the plain, unguarded way she had laughed at dusk, believing herself entirely alone on an ordinary evening beside an ordinary river, unaware that a duke stood watching from the bridge above, already beginning, without knowing it himself, to fall in love with the truest thing he had ever seen. And on quiet evenings for the rest of their lives, whenever they returned to Thornecombe, Gareth would walk with her down to that same stretch of water at dusk, and stand where he had once stood as a stranger in disguise, and watch his wife kneel at the widow's rock out of nothing but old habit and fondness, no longer washing anyone's linen but her own children's small clothes, and he would think, every single time, that he had never in his life been so grateful for the courage it had taken to walk down from that bridge and speak to her, nor for the far greater courage it had taken her, in the end, to forgive him for having waited so long to tell her the truth. It was, they would both say in later years, the best bargain either of them had ever struck, not a duke's fortune traded for a washerwoman's beauty, as the county gossips liked to tell it, but two wounded people who had each learned, through hard and separate griefs, to expect very little from love, and who had found, entirely by accident on an ordinary bridge at dusk, that they had been wrong to expect so little all along. The river went on running gold and then grey each evening at Thornecombe, indifferent to dukes and washerwomen alike, exactly as it always had. But the village remembered, for generations afterward, the story of the girl who had washed clothes at the water's edge, never once suspecting that the quiet stranger on the bridge above her was already, in every way that mattered, falling irrevocably and forever in love. Lady Ophelia, in her old age, was fond of telling a slightly embellished version of the tale to any young lady of the family who despaired of ever being seen for herself rather than for her fortune or her face, and she always ended it the same way, tapping her cane once upon the floor for emphasis. "A duke may own half a county," she would say, "and still know nothing of what makes a woman worth loving, until he is humble enough to stand quietly on a bridge and simply watch. And a woman may own nothing at all, save a strong back and a stubborn heart," she would add, "and still be the richest prize in England, if only someone has the wisdom to notice." Marianne herself never fully lost the habits of the girl she had been at the washing stone. She kept her own household accounts long after any duchess was expected to trouble herself with such things, and she made a point, every spring, of walking down to the tenant farms herself rather than relying on any steward's report, a habit her husband found, each year, more endearing than the last. She taught her daughters to mend their own gloves, and her sons to shake the hand of every groom and farmhand on the estate, as though he were a duke's equal, because she had not forgotten, and did not intend to let her children forget, what it was to be looked past, and what it cost a person to be looked past, and what it was worth, beyond any fortune, to finally be truly seen. And Gareth, for his part, never again stood on a bridge without thinking of the evening he had lingered there far longer than any inspection of stonework required, watching a stranger at the river's edge laugh at something only she could hear, and felt, for the first time in years, the quiet, dangerous stirring of a heart he had believed thoroughly and permanently guarded against hope. He had been wrong about a great many things in his life, he would tell his own children in later years, but he had never once regretted being wrong about that.